Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. And I am ready to start taking a look at Anvil number 2. And this magazine is a very interesting study in contrast to the previous magazine, both because of what it does and what it does not do. Now, large scale, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the magazine as a whole right now. As I did with the previous volume of Anvil, there's one story that really stood out to me that I wanted to dissect in a little bit of depth. And then I'm probably going to make another video, maybe two, talking about the contents of the magazine as a whole. Again, trying to give a couple of minutes of feedback to each story or comic, just for, some thoughts on it. All in all, again, I think this is a pretty strong project. And I'm not just saying that because I'm published in this one. It does what all anthology magazines have done. It gives you a lot of a whole bunch of different things, not all of which is going to be to your feed. But right now, as with the previous magazine, I want to talk most about the story I've been thinking about the most, but for different reasons. And it's not actually going to be the Prowler of Blog Square by Micah Murray. That is the cover, the featured piece, the cover piece. It's not the one I've been thinking about the most. Unlike Fleet of Theseus, I've actually been thinking the most about Mourning Light by R.J. Shaw. Now, I'm not overly familiar with R.J.'s work. I know he's published a comic called Thomas Valiant. He has a YouTube channel called The Fourth Age. I've watched a couple of videos on that, but I'm really not familiar with his body of work. I know that he is a voice that is very respected in the indie comics and comic commentary community, but he's never been a channel I followed very closely. So I can't comment a whole lot on how Mourning Light compares to his other stuff. But I found this a very interesting story to read, in particular because it is set in the world of Crom the Destroyer. I don't know if the protagonist is Crom the Destroyer. It doesn't seem to be, but it is set at very least in the same world. And this is a kind of a pulp story in the vein of Conan the Barbarian. I thought that was kind of interesting, and I figured I would read it with an eye towards potentially picking up Crom the Destroyer. I haven't read Thomas Valiant. I'm not a huge fan of superhero comics, so I figured I would give that one a pass. I know so about these kind of pulp, sword, and sandal stories. I've read some Conan the Barbarian, and it wasn't really my cup of tea. So I figured I would read this and see what I thought of the approach to it. And as I've already said, Conan the Barbarian, and honestly, a lot of those kind of tales of savagery, Tarzan, those kind of stories, they never really appealed to me a whole lot. And I have to say that Mourning Light kind of hit the same place. I can see what they're doing, but it's not really my cup of tea. It's not something I'm ever probably going to seek out and really enjoy. I can appreciate the technique that you see in those kind of stories, but it doesn't really grab my attention. So why have I been thinking about it so much? Well, let's go over that. As is the case with these stories I take a deep dive in, I am going to spoil this story so that I can discuss it at length, the different things going on here, and what I think of them and why I think those things. So if you are not interested in having this story spoiled to you, well, maybe read it first and then come back to get my thoughts. Or, if you just aren't interested in an entire story recap and you just want some quick highlights to see what I think of the magazine as a whole before you commit to buying it, then maybe watch the next video I put out on Anvil number 2. And then hopefully that will convince you to pick up the magazine, because I do think it is a worthwhile investment. Hopefully that will convince you to pick it up. And then once you read the story, you can come back and watch it. If you are just interested in a discussion of a story and maybe you pick it up and read it later, maybe you don't, then I appreciate your sticking around and listening to this. So Mourning Light follows an unnamed protagonist. We know he's a Northlander. His name is never given directly to us. We know he's recently escaped from a mountain where he faced some kind of very dark magic. and he's kind of recuperating on the surface of the mountain after he's escaped, or it says in the story, after he has been expelled from it. And he is at a campfire on the side of the mountain when he sees an apparition appear. And he follows that apparition into a cave. What he finds in the cave is a thing of dark magic, not surprising given where he is. And he then undoes that black magic. What he finds specifically is a woman held in the coils of a serpent. The serpent is devouring the woman, but when moonlight hits the serpent's power wanes, it dissolves into sand, and the woman's body reconstitutes itself. Our protagonist has to then open some kind of a hole that is plugged with a stone, and in order to do that, he has to work his way past a swarm of malicious bugs that seems to have some kind of a hive mind. Opening the hole releases flame into the chamber that destroys the serpent and the woman and most of the bugs. Some of them survive, but they vanish after the serpent is dead. And this is basically the story. Guy sees a problem, guy overcomes the problem, puts to rest an evil force. All in all, pretty engaging premise, and it is told in a very pulpy writing style. And that is one of the things that has kept me thinking about this over the past couple of weeks. Pulp is also known for purple prose. If you're not familiar with purple prose, it means that a lot of flowery and elaborate language is used to describe what is going on, be it actions taken, the environments people find themselves in, or the thoughts going through their heads. Now, purple prose is kind of a controversial thing. Some people think purple prose is a waste of time. Some people think it is the epitome of good writing. People who love purple prose really, really love it. They love the creativity, the use of vocabulary, the intellectual engagement of figuring out what these words are trying to tell you in a given setting. I don't have a problem with purple prose myself, but I am not a huge fan of it. Again, it's not something I seek out. It's not something that bothers me when I see it either. I just, as a writer, when I encounter purple prose, I think, okay, this person is generally doing something very good. They are using their vocabulary and their understanding of grammar to create very interesting word pictures. But as a writer, I tend not to use it because I am concerned first and foremost with communicating a message to the audience. And I worry sometimes, not so much that the vocabulary, but the context of the purple prose may make it harder for the message to get through. I generally tend to use very flowery and descriptive things as a way to differentiate character voices, perhaps, or as a way to show that we are dealing with something very outside of the ordinary. And then I keep most of my language simple and straightforward. So what was very interesting for me to think about in this story was the various places where Shaw's prose works and where it does not. Most of it does present us with very good word pictures that help us to understand the situation and the mindset of our protagonist in a way that is very interesting to contemplate. So, for example, we are told that we have several references to the Northlander's primal instinct that takes over and has him cast his gaze about, looking for advantage and threat or danger. Advantage and danger. That is a very, very well-constructed sentence. It shows us the flow of our protagonist's thought process. He's not in wonder at the sight of many crystals reflecting moonlight into the cavern. He is just looking about, looking for what could be a threat to him or what could possibly serve him in the situation he finds himself in. And these sentences are, rather than being very blunt and on the face of it, they kind of pull us into his mindset with these very engaging words that have us think about what exactly his mindset is and how we can share that with him. Because we have to figure out these words that are describing the mindset. So that's a very good use of purple prose. On the other hand, danger of purple prose that you may construct word pictures that don't actually say anything meaningful, or worse, may contradict themselves. And there are several points in here where I got kind of lost trying to puzzle out exactly what Shaw was trying to say. And as I have mulled these over and tried to figure out ins and outs of what exactly I am supposed to be gathering, I've come to the conclusion that, excuse me, if you are going to write a story with purple prose, you have to be very, very careful in the way you construct these sentences. Not just for the sake of clarity for your reader, but to make sure you are actually saying what you hope to say. Some of the unclear sentences are pretty straightforward once you think about them, but the fact that you have to stop and think about something that should be straightforward is in and of itself not ideal. Let me give you an example. Our protagonist approaches, there are actually several moments in this story where our protagonist makes it clear that the words he is seeing written or hearing spoken are old. And there is a, near the end of the story, there is this sentence: like the altar and the woman's words, their armor boasted the same ancient symbols. Now, on the face of it, that just says the armor has old symbols on it, right? That's what it's meant to say. Just like all the other old stuff he's been encountering, these symbols are old, right? That's what he's trying to say. The problem is, it also makes it sound like the woman is speaking in symbols. The woman's words, it says. But the woman is speaking aloud. It doesn't make any sense for her words to be appearing in symbols in the air. And that kind of sentence structure can very easily be worked out. Like the symbols on the altar, I guess you could say the woman's words were ancient, and the symbol, or I had a formula for this, but it seems to have evaded me. As you can see, it's not as straightforward as you might think to build one of these sentences. And you can structure them in a way that says what you want to say. You would have the altar and the armor symbols be ancient, and the woman's words be archaic, which is the word that is used to describe them earlier. And don't get that worked out, you have this speed bump then for the reader. Not a speed bump that is drawing them into the story, thinking about what words mean or what that says about the world, but a speed bump that takes them out of the story, saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. That is really something, if you want to use purple prose, you have to be on the lookout for. There's a similar moment earlier in the story where we have our protagonist take a step back. Before his eyes could fully adjust to the uncanny glow, a savage internal counsel drew him back. Okay, so what about this causes that speed bump moment? You have a savage counsel. A savage can just mean, now savage, the word can just mean something primitive. You could have a primitive counsel, but in all the other contexts that we've had so far, talking about our protagonist's thought process, we've had words like primal or primitive, something that points specifically to a previous time, right? Savage is something that can exist at any time, and in particular, at least in the classical definition, it refers to a ruling of power over the powerless. Now, we have other words for that in the modern context, but originally, a savage people were just a people who were ruled militarily, and a civilized people were ruled by the civilians, right? That's where the two word structures come from. So, having a savage, the word savage, contrasted against counsel, which could just mean advice, seems, but, kind of also brings to mind a group of people deliberating, right? A civilized political structure. That kind of took me out of the story a bit, especially because we mostly get his internal thoughts referred to as instincts or nudges or intuitions. To suddenly have advice and counsel brought into it was it was a speed bump. You can't just write your purple prose in isolation. once you start to build a pattern through it, you have to maintain that pattern. And here, having counsel thrown in, this very political sounding word, in place of words like instinct or intuition, this constructed a very different sentence from what I think was intended. I think, again, Shaw's intention was to refer to a primitive thought, a lizard brain kind of reaction. Instead, I had this momentary glimpse of a group of people, particularly armed, maybe medieval or Renaissance people, deliberating and perhaps almost coming to blows. That was the initial picture I got from this phrase. And it was not, once I look back at the context, I'm like, okay, that's not what he's saying. But again, a speed bump. It takes me out of the story for just a moment. There are also a couple of places where, the prose contradicts. And to be perfectly honest, some of this is not even purple prose, I don't think. Although it could have come about just because Shaw was looking to be, have that very eloquent feel to the prose here. That's not exactly, there's a difference between elegant prose and purple prose. Trying to speak in a refined manner versus trying to be deliberately as flowery as possible. Either one is fine, in my opinion, but they require, again, that extra level of attention and care. So there are a couple of places in here where that happens. We get a reference to a howl, and then in the next sentence, we are told that the howl has clear strains of pain within the soft feminine voice. I don't think of howls as something that are soft. I can see a clear feminine voice howling. I can see a pained feminine voice howling. I can see just a feminine voice howling. But by tacking soft onto feminine, I then have a contradiction with the notion of a howl, which is a very hard sound. It is fully supported by all the muscles in your throat and chest. And that creates a contradictory word picture. By the same token, there's a reference to a stately hall, which is then in the next sentence described as a circular room. Again, when I think of halls, I think of a square room, probably longer in one direction than in the other, much longer. And, fairly hard corners, or at least colonnades, not something circular. So again, we have these word pictures that are not entirely consistent with what we're being told. And I mean, it's good to have these more elaborate word pictures built, but it's necessary to also express them as clearly as possible. And when you're just building an elaborate word picture, if you're not taking care to make sure those pictures are consistent over the course of the story, you can't have those speed bumps. So that's really one of the big things I've been thinking about this after reading this story, is like, how do you make sure your prose is consistent, not just in its level of elaboration, but in the kind of images you build? Unless, of course, it is your point to have contradictory images. And I think that when we talk about whether your wordplay is going to be flowery or not, whether you're going to have purple prose or very simple or direct language, we're kind of missing the point of discussing prose. Because the real issue of prose is whether it gets your point across or not. And, there are some places in here where it does not. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about. The other thing I've been thinking about is how you present ideas. There are some really great ideas in Shaw's story. This really horrifying image of a person who is being tormented, locked in a constant struggle with this malevolent force that is the serpent. You have a woman who has, for some reason, been trapped, struggling with it for apparently a very long time, because all the symbology we see associated with her and with her dead allies, and of course the words she uses to speak, we're told, are all very old. Old for our protagonist, who has apparently been out of circulation for quite some time. So even older than our very primitive protagonist. That's a very interesting and powerful idea. This person who is making a sacrifice to hold at bay an evil force. And then the stranger who shows up and sees this and is so moved by this, he says, I have to set this person free. That is a great, great core to a story. And for the most part, while I have highlighted some places where the prose is not so good, for the most part, you get a very clear idea of what's going on, of this struggle, and the lengths that our protagonist is going to set it free. But what I have been thinking about is the symbology of the story. Something that I thought was very interesting is that our protagonist sees almost a set of visions that lead him into this cave. And as he comes through, he's going through these panes of crystal that reflect the light and reflect the images of what is going on inside. And it's very confusing and a little bit disturbing. But our hero is clear-sighted enough to see past these illusions and to get into the interior chamber. That's really cool. And then we have the serpent there as the primary antagonist, and that stacks on top of the idea of illusions, right? Because the serpent is a creature that is associated with deceit and is associated with longevity or regeneration, right? Because when snakes shed their skin, it's kind of a rebirth metaphor. A lot of cultures have seen it that way. So I didn't really have a problem with most of the things we see going on here. The snake is strangling a person. The snake is dying and being reborn. The person is dying and being reborn. Symbolically, all of that makes sense. You have illusions because the serpent is a liar, and that is reflected through literally, it is reflected through the reflections the protagonist sees. All of that is very cool. What's a bit strange is there is an element of dissonance in this, where the symbology does not seem to hold together all the way through, because the snake is made of sand. That's a bit odd. He's on a mountain. We're told repeatedly it's very cold on this mountain. It's full of snow. And yet this creature is made of sand, which is a very desert-like analogy. Now, ultimately, the snake is fused into pieces of glass when the protagonist opens the fume hole and vents volcanic heat into the room. So it's possible we're supposed to associate sand with the glass that make, the crystals that make up the cave. So I can almost see that working. But the snake also commands a horde of insects. And a horde of insects is a weird symbolic piece to have in this story. I'm not quite sure what it signifies. They are devouring creatures, and I suppose you can see a snake as a devouring creature. That is something they do. In particular, a snake with a big lump in the middle of its body is kind of a symbol of gluttony, I suppose. It's not something I immediately associate with snakes when I see them. I tend to, again, more think of first and foremost, the idea of deception, and then you have venom, because not all snakes are poisonous, but a lot of the most famous snakes are. And then you have, that symbol of vitality, of death and rebirth. So those are the three big things I think of when I see a snake. And insects, I guess they can be venomous. We're told these insects are venomous. We don't know if the serpent itself is or not. But insects I tend to associate with devouring, a plague of locusts, potentially poison. But again, they are not creatures that deal well with cold. They don't have a whole lot of fat on their bodies. They get cold very quickly. You see almost no insects in the middle of the winter, unless you're, inside. Then all the insects come in to stay warm. It's a bit of a confusing symbolic picture as well. So that's another reason I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been trying to work out the contradictions. Of course, insects molt just like snakes do. But very few cultures have associated them that kind of death and rebirth imagery. I haven't worked it out. I'm not quite sure symbolically what I'm supposed to make of all of these pieces. Perhaps there is a symbology unique to Shaw's world that I'm supposed to take away from this. But if that's the case, well, there's no hints that this is something unique to Shaw's world that I'm supposed to take away from it. So the other thing about this is I've been presented with a very fascinating conflict in this story, and I'm trying to figure out who all the players are. But we have this one player in the story which doesn't quite seem to fit. And that really seems to be the thing about Morning Light that keeps my mind coming back to it. Not all the pieces fit. And it's okay to have mystery in a story, but this is a mystery that says the story is, a good mystery is, I want an answer to this. I want to keep looking until I understand this. But Morning Light feels complete, or at least the struggle between the serpent, the bugs, the protagonist, and the woman seems complete. So this is not really so much a dangling plot thread, so much as something played out there that I can't fully understand. And for some people, it's okay to have a contradiction in a story that doesn't fully add up. But if I don't understand exactly what the conflict in the story was, for me, that is very bothersome. And while I can get the conflict between the deception and the torture of the venomous snake and the woman, and this weird cycle of death and rebirth they're locked in, until the protagonist comes and turns the balance, don't know what to make of this swarm of malevolent insects. And I feel like it dilutes the power of that primal struggle that the protagonist is ultimately bringing to a conclusion there. So that also bothers me. And it's in trying to work out those little points of friction, those points of stories that annoy me, that I get some of my best ideas for stories as well. So I think the reason I keep thinking about it is because my writer's brain is asking the rest of me, how do we work this out? How do we make something that makes sense out of this piece of story that feels incomplete? And that is something that I think is very healthy for writers to do when they're looking at someone else's work. Because you're never going to be satisfied with someone else's work any more than you're going to be satisfied with your own work. This is the curse of being a writer, I'm afraid. And you look at a story and you say, well, how could this story be better? And ironically, it is stories that have these weaknesses that speak specifically to you as a writer. Because there are lots of stories with weaknesses that say nothing to me. I'm just like, okay, yeah, you could have maybe connected this bit up better, or your turn of phrase could be better here. But when you have an issue with a story that you really find yourself thinking about, that is when you have the opportunity to really examine it and say, how would I improve my craft such that I could tell this story without this flaw? And I think that in and of itself says that Shaw was trying, and probably succeeded to some extent, in doing something really neat with this story. He told a story that feels like it has its own coherent internal symbology. And even if I didn't pick up on all of it, in trying to sort that out, there is a lot to be gained there. I don't know for sure whether the symbology in Shaw's story was simply not thought through, whether it has some logic to it that I can't pick up on, or whether Shaw deliberately chose something nonsensical in order to keep the story from being too pat. That is something that writers also do as well. I don't know as I like it as a narrative technique, but there are lots of people who do, and they like to write that way. They like to put contradictions within the available logic of their story to create more mystery and more suspense. And there are lots of people who like to read those stories as well. I can't say I really understand that, but I don't question it as a narrative technique because it seems to be so continually successful. So I'm not sure what was going on here. And I think that the fact that I wasn't sure is the thing that has made this the most interesting story to me in Anvil number 2. I don't think that makes it the best story. I don't think that I would try to write a story like this, but it is a very fascinating thing to think about. And having these stories that maybe you wouldn't normally read, but still grab your imaginations, is one of the strengths of an anthology like Anvil magazine. Now, it probably sounds like I've been negative towards this story. And you know what? To a large extent, I have been. I have been specifically critiquing the flaws in Shaw's prose. And I have been specifically critiquing questions of symbology and mythos and meaning. That's because I think it's very interesting to talk about these things. And I don't find, as I said, these Conan-style stories, I normally don't find them interesting at all. So just having these things that, they are kind of negative, but are still interesting, I think is worth talking about. I have, there is a lot of debate when you're talking about reviewing and critiquing something, whether it's worthwhile to be negative. But I think it is worthwhile to talk about prose and writing techniques and symbology and thematics, even if you have to be negative, rather than to just ignore a story that has a rich vein of contemplation and ideas in it, simply because most of what you have to say about them are negative. I think Shaw has put together a pretty good story. Yes, there are a few lapses in prose. Yes, I do have some questions about the symbology and how that relates to the themes of the story. But I also recognize that prose and symbology versus themes are pretty niche things to talk about. And just because of the things I want to talk about, and my thoughts about them are not particularly positive, I don't think that entirely discredits the story. I think it just shows that even a story that may not interest you in general can still have those little things you can learn and grow from, or at least think about as time goes on. That's good for a writer. It's also good for a reader because it makes the reader more discerning. Becoming a more discerning reader, understanding more and more about what interests you and why, is a very important part of being a good reader, a literate person. And that, in and of itself, a worthwhile goal, at least in my opinion. But you can let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. Use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.